Father's Day was supposed to feel warm. It was supposed to be about family, gratitude, maybe even a few awkward hugs around a dinner table. But that year, in my daughter's living room, it felt like a courtroom, one where the verdict had already been decided. The table was covered with roast beef, mashed potatoes, and all the trimmings. Laughter spilled like cheap wine, loud and easy. My daughter bustled around, placing gift bags near each seat. Her husband's parents were there, dressed sharp, smelling of expensive cologne. I sat quietly at the far end, waiting. She started with her father-in-law. A wide, glossy envelope tied with a silver ribbon. He pulled it open and read the bold print, 7-day Caribbean cruise for two. Gasps, claps, cheers. He stood, kissed her on the cheek, and said, "Sweetheart, this is incredible. You didn't have to." "No, Dad," she said, smiling up at him. "You deserve it." Everyone laughed and clinked glasses. The room glowed. And then, as if remembering a minor chore, she turned to me. "Here, Dad." She handed me a thin slip of paper folded into a birthday card someone else might have thrown away. "It's a lottery ticket. Just for fun." I stared at it, bright colors, cheap ink, a scratch-off corner. Her father-in-law leaned back in his chair, cruise voucher in hand, already planning what shirt he'd wear on the deck. My daughter beamed at him. The room smelled of gravy and wine, but suddenly it all tasted bitter. I forced a smile, though my lips trembled. "Thank you," I said. 2 words, hollow as the ticket in my palm. Nobody clapped. Nobody cheered. Nobody even looked my way. Instead, they moved on, passing salad bowls, laughing about flight upgrades, the conversation orbiting around the man with the cruise and the woman who gave it. I was a shadow at my own family's table. I lowered my eyes to the ticket. A joke. A throwaway. The difference between deserving everything and getting nothing condensed into 2 flimsy inches of paper. The fork in my hand felt heavier than steel. I wanted to speak, to remind her of all the Father's Days I worked double shifts just so she could have ballet lessons, the winter nights I went without a coat so she wouldn't freeze. But I said nothing. Silence was safer. The chair scraped as I pushed back, unnoticed. I stepped outside into the cool air. The screen door shut behind me with a hollow thud. Inside, they kept laughing. I sat alone on the porch, clutching the ticket, the faint sound of their voices leaking through the walls. The night smelled of grass and car exhaust, and for a moment, I wasn't a father at all. Just an extra at someone else's celebration. And yet, as I turned the ticket over in my hands, something flickered. A thought too small to name, but sharp enough to cut through the silence. Back inside, the laughter only grew louder. I could hear it through the thin walls of the house I had once helped paint when my daughter and her husband first bought it. Back then, I was the one holding the ladder, steadying the frame, patching the drywall. Now I was little more than background noise, a presence to be tolerated. When I finally stepped back into the dining room, the moment hit me like a stage light. All eyes were on my son-in-law's father as he described the cruise package in detail. 7 nights, balcony suite, all-inclusive, he bragged, holding up the brochure like a trophy. I've always wanted to see the Caribbean. Finally, I get to live a little. Applause filled the room. My daughter clapped the loudest, her cheeks flushed with pride. Her mother-in-law reached across the table to squeeze her hand. "You're such a thoughtful daughter," she said warmly. Then her gaze flicked toward me, still standing by the doorway with my folded lottery ticket. Her smile faltered for a second, then returned, polite but empty. I slipped back into my chair, unnoticed until my grandson piped up, "Grandpa, what did you get?" The room quieted. My daughter forced a quick laugh. "Oh, just a scratch-off ticket," she said breezily, brushing it away as though it were lint on her sleeve. A few chuckles followed. The kind meant to dismiss, not to include. "Hey, maybe you'll get lucky," my son-in-law added, smirking as he poured himself another glass of wine. "Who knows? Stranger things have happened." The others laughed again, louder this time, as if luck were the only miracle a man like me could hope for. I pressed the ticket flat against the tablecloth, hiding the tremor in my hand. I didn't answer. What could I say? That I had worked 50 years not for cruises or luxuries, but to keep food on the same daughter's plate. That I had carried debts in silence, swallowed humiliation long before tonight. No one wanted that story. So I kept quiet, chewing on overcooked roast, listening to their plans for excursions and spa days, their voices rising like a chorus met for someone else's song. At one point, my daughter leaned across the table toward her father-in-law. "Don't worry about expenses while you're there," she said, beaming. "We'll cover everything. It's our gift to you." The words struck harder than any slap. She could cover everything, for him. For me, a ticket worth $1. I swallowed hard, staring down at my plate, and felt the room shrink around me. The humiliation wasn't private anymore. It was public, carved into the air for everyone to see. And no one, not a single person, came to my defense. That night, long after the laughter had died down and the dishwasher hummed in the kitchen, I sat alone on the porch. The lottery ticket was still folded in my pocket, creased from my grip. I hadn't scratched it, hadn't even looked at it again. It wasn't a gift, it was an afterthought. The house glowed behind me, warm light spilling through the curtains. Inside, my daughter and her husband sat with his parents, talking over dessert, their voices muffled but easy. A family within a family. And me, left outside like the draft sneaking under the door. I thought about all the years I had worked to keep her safe. The double shifts at the plant. The nights I ate crackers so she could have a hot meal. The weekends I stood in the bleachers, freezing, just to watch her march in the band. Back then, she would run to me after every performance, eyes shining, proud to be my daughter. Now she could barely look at me. I pulled the ticket from my pocket and stared at it under the porch light. The colors were faded, cheap, the kind of thing you buy at a gas station register without a second thought. A gift that cost her nothing, less than nothing, when I thought of the cruise she had planned for her father-in-law. I turned the ticket over in my hand, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the sting of tears. Not because of the paper, not because of what I held, but because of what I didn't hold anymore, her respect. It cut deeper than any bill collector, any sleepless night, any bad back from years of labor. Disrespect from strangers was easy enough to ignore. But from your own blood? That was a wound without bandages. The porch creaked as I shifted, trying to steady myself. Somewhere inside, someone laughed, high, carefree, unburdened. The sound rolled through me like thunder, shaking loose memories I didn't want to remember. I could have formed and demanded answers, shouted the truth of who I had been and what I had given. But what good would that do? Rage doesn't buy respect. Demands don't build love. So I sat in silence, swallowing the ache, letting it settle into my chest. The night air bit at my skin, and I welcomed it. Cold was easier to feel than betrayal. I folded the ticket once more, slipped it back into my pocket, and whispered to no one but the dark, maybe this is all I'll ever be to her, a scratch-off chance at nothing. The days that followed carried a heaviness I couldn't shake. My life had been pared down to routines so simple, so bare, they barely felt like living at all. Morning meant oatmeal from a box and coffee so thin you could see the bottom of the cup. I ate alone in a quiet kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator. The family I had raised, the daughter I had poured decades into, was just a town away, yet it felt like another world. I spent afternoons fixing things that didn't need much fixing. The old truck in my driveway had more rust than paint, but it still coughed to life when I turned the key. I'd tinker with it anyway, replacing bolts, wiping grease on rags already stiff with stains. It wasn't about the truck, it was about staying busy, keeping my hands from shaking, my mind from circling back to that Father's Day dinner. Meanwhile, my daughter's life played out like a glossy magazine spread. Photos online of her smiling beside her in-laws, champagne flutes raised, the caption reading "Family First." I noticed the absence of my face in every one of those pictures. It was as though I had been edited out of her story. The cruelest part wasn't just being left out, it was being left behind. I saw the contrast everywhere. My neighbors waved from new cars, talking about vacations, mortgage refinances, retirement plans. I kept patching the same roof shingles, sweeping the same porch steps, hoping no one noticed the peeling paint on the siding. At the grocery store, I clipped coupons, counting every penny, while a woman ahead of me filled her cart with imported wine and filet mignon. When the cashier asked if I wanted to buy a lottery ticket at checkout, I almost laughed. If only she knew. But the silence inside my house was the worst. Empty chairs, empty tables, empty frames where family photos should have hung. I had taken some down myself, not out of anger, but because looking at them hurt too much. A smiling little girl in pigtails holding my hand, who had she grown into? Someone who saw me as less than the man sitting across from her at that Father's Day table. I told myself this was what aging looked like, becoming invisible, slowly fading into the background while younger, louder voices took over. But deep down, I knew it was more than age. It was betrayal. Still, I said nothing. I let the days roll on, quiet and unremarkable, each one pressing me further into the margins. At night, when the world finally went still, I'd sit in my recliner, the lottery ticket folded neatly in the drawer beside me. I hadn't scratched it yet. I told myself it didn't matter, that it was just paper. But every now and then, when the loneliness pressed hardest, I'd wonder, what if? Late one night, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at nothing in particular. The refrigerator buzzed in the background, and the clock on the wall ticked loud enough to make the silence heavier. My eyes landed on an old photo frame leaning against the counter. Dust clung to the glass, but the image inside was clear, my daughter at 10 years old, grinning wide, her missing front teeth on full display. She was holding up a trophy from her school spelling bee, the kind of moment a father never forgets. Back then, money was always tight, but I never let her see the cracks. I'd take on double shifts at the plant, my hands raw from welding, my back screaming from the weight of steel. Paychecks came in small, but somehow they stretched, barely. Rent, groceries, the electric bill, and still I made sure she had enough for ballet lessons, new shoes for school, the field trip she begged to go on. I remember one winter in particular. The furnace had broken, and I couldn't afford the repair until the next month. The house was cold enough to see our breath. I bundled her in 2 coats, told her it was camping inside to make her laugh. That night, I slept without a blanket so she could have both. My bones ached, but her smile in the morning made it worth it. There was the Christmas I pawned my watch, a gift from my own father, just so she'd find the bike she wanted under the tree. She never knew. I told her Santa was generous that year. And when she hugged me, squealing, promising to ride it every day, I thought, this is what being a father means. Every milestone, I was there. High school graduation, I stood in the sun for hours just to get a photo of her walking across the stage. College acceptance, I worked weekends to help cover what scholarships didn't. When her first car broke down, I sold my tools to buy her a used one that could at least get her to class. It was never about luxury. It was about sacrifice. About putting her needs above mine, no matter the cost. And yet, years later, at that Father's Day table, she looked at me and saw less than the man across from her. She forgot the winters I went without heat, the Christmases I gave up my own gifts, the decades of labor spent shaping her future. The lottery ticket still sat in my drawer, untouched. Cheap, flimsy, insignificant. But staring at that photo of her as a child, I realized something. The ticket wasn't worthless because of its price, it was worthless because of what it represented. To her, my worth had been reduced to a scratch-off chance, a disposable gesture. I clenched the frame in my hands, whispering to the girl frozen in the photograph, I gave you everything. And now, you give me nothing. It didn't stop with Father's Day. If anything, that moment opened the floodgates. My daughter and her husband grew bolder, as though giving me scraps had set a new standard. One Sunday dinner, I arrived with a pie I had baked, nothing fancy, just apple and cinnamon, the way she used to love when she was little. I placed it on the counter, proud in a quiet way. She glanced at it inside. Oh, Dad. You really didn't have to. We already ordered dessert from the bakery. Her voice was light, but the dismissal was sharp. She set my pie aside, untouched, while the store-bought cheesecake took center stage at the table. Her father-in-law chuckled, carving into his slice. Old-fashioned, he said, as if the word itself were an insult. My daughter laughed, just a little too loud. Exactly. He still thinks homemade is impressive. The words stung more than I wanted to admit. I lowered my eyes, pushing mashed potatoes around my plate while conversation moved on without me. Another evening, her husband made a joke about me fixing my truck in the driveway. Must be nice not having a real job to worry about, he smirked. Retirement seems like endless tinkering. They laughed. I stayed quiet. But the worst came one night when I offered to babysit my grandson. He was my joy, my one soft place left in this fractured family. I suggested taking him to the park, the same swings I once pushed my daughter on. My son-in-law shook his head. We'd rather not. You know, in your condition, you're not as strong as you used to be. I froze. My daughter didn't defend me. She just pressed her lips together and looked away. That silence said more than any insult. I realized then that in their eyes, I wasn't a father, or even a grandfather. I was a burden. Something to manage, not someone to honor. I didn't argue. I didn't fight. I sat back in my chair, let the words hang in the air, and swallowed them whole. But deep inside, a part of me shifted. The humiliation piled higher, the betrayal cut deeper, but the silence was no longer weakness. It was waiting. It was late, well past midnight, when I finally sat down at the kitchen table. The house was quiet except for the faint rattle of the old refrigerator. I rubbed my temples, replaying the insults from dinner like a broken record. The pie I had baked still sat on the counter, untouched, a sad reminder of how invisible I had become. I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the crumpled slip of paper. The lottery ticket. My so-called gift. I had carried it around for days, folding and unfolding it until the edges had grown soft. I had thought about throwing it away more than once. Why keep something that only reminded me of how little I mattered? But that night, maybe out of boredom, maybe out of stubbornness, I pulled it out and laid it flat on the table. The television was still on in the living room, muted but glowing faintly. Numbers scrolled across the bottom of the screen, the winning lottery numbers from that evening's draw. I almost laughed. The timing felt like some cosmic joke. I slid the ticket closer, adjusting my glasses. The print was cheap and smudged, but the numbers were clear enough. I matched the first digit on the screen. Then the second. Then the third. My heart skipped. I leaned in closer, checking again. 4 numbers matched. Then 5. My breath caught in my throat. My hand began to shake. I whispered the final number aloud, my voice trembling as it lined up perfectly with the last one on the ticket. I sat frozen, staring at the slip of paper that suddenly didn't feel so cheap anymore. It couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of mistake. I grabbed the phone, pulled up the state lottery website, and checked again. Same numbers. Same sequence. Same jackpot. $120 million. The number didn't even make sense to me. It was more money than I had ever dreamed of. More than my father, and his father before him, could have made in a lifetime of hard work. I pushed back from the table, my chair scraping across the floor. My knees felt weak, my chest tight. I walked to the sink, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at myself in the cracked mirror above it. The old man looking back wasn't the same one who had been humiliated at that Father's Day dinner. He wasn't the man who had been laughed at for bringing pie, or dismissed as old-fashioned. In my pocket, folded and trembling against my chest, was the kind of power none of them could have imagined. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I felt dangerous. The ticket trembled in my hand long after the numbers stopped scrolling across the screen. I read them again and again, convinced my eyes had betrayed me. Each time, the truth only grew heavier. I wasn't holding a worthless scrap of paper. I was holding $120 million. My pulse hammered in my ears. I sat down hard, gripping the edge of the table as though the floor itself might give way. All those years of scraping by, of clipping coupons, of turning down doctor visits I couldn't afford, and now, in a single stroke of luck, everything had changed. I laughed once, low and shaky, but the sound died quickly. There was no joy in it, not yet. Only disbelief. I thought about calling someone, but who? My daughter? The same daughter who had given me the ticket as a joke, who had brushed me aside in favor of another man she called Dad. The idea of hearing her voice twist into false sweetness made my stomach turn. No. This was mine. I folded the ticket carefully, pressing the creases flat, and slipped it back into my wallet. For the first time in years, the leather didn't feel empty. The house around me looked the same, cracked linoleum floor, flickering light above the stove, the smell of stale coffee, but something fundamental had shifted. The weight of every insult, every dismissal, every "you're old-fashioned and you're a burden," it didn't crush me anymore. It fueled me. I stood, pacing the kitchen, my bare feet cold against the tile. The money meant freedom. It meant choices. It meant I didn't have to beg for scraps of respect from people who treated me like I was already gone. But I also knew what it meant if I revealed it too soon. The crocodile tears, the sudden phone calls, the empty apologies. They would come crawling, not because they loved me, but because they loved the number printed on that check. So I chose silence. I slid the wallet into the drawer of my nightstand, tucked beneath old receipts and spare keys. Then I sat on the edge of my bed, staring into the dark. The humiliation of Father's Day replayed in my head, the cruise package held high, the laughter, the lottery ticket dismissed with a smirk. Only now, the memory didn't sting the same way. Because this time, I wasn't powerless. This time, I had the one thing they could never take back. And I intended to use it. The following morning, sunlight poured through the blinds, but I barely noticed. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of weak coffee, the lottery ticket folded neatly inside my wallet, heavy as a brick against my chest. I kept running the same thought through my mind: silence. That was the key. Not celebration, not confession. Silence. I imagined walking into my daughter's house, announcing the win, watching her face change from indifference to awe. For a moment, the fantasy almost felt satisfying. But then I saw the rest: the forced hugs, the hollow words, the crocodile tears. I knew her too well. The love wouldn't be real. It would be performed for the money. No, silence was smarter. Silence meant control. I moved through the day like nothing had happened. I drove my rusty truck to the grocery store, clipped coupons, nodded at the cashier as if I weren't carrying a fortune in my back pocket. Neighbors waved as they watered their lawns, and I waved back, just another old man living on the edge of town. But inside, I was alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. Every slight, every insult, every dismissal now replayed in my mind with new meaning. They thought they had stripped me of worth. They thought I was disposable. What they didn't know was that the ground beneath their feet had already shifted. That evening, I walked past the photo frames on the wall. Pictures of my daughter smiling with her in-laws, her arm hooked proudly around her husband's father. Numb with me. It used to hurt, seeing myself erased. Now, it only steeled my resolve. I whispered into the empty room, my voice steady: "You'll show me who you really are, before I show you who I've become." The plan wasn't ready yet, but the seed was planted. All I had to do was wait, watch, and let their true colors shine brighter than ever. And when the time came, when the mask slipped completely, that was when I would answer. The days after my discovery became a kind of private theater. I moved through each moment deliberately, saying little, doing less, and watching everything. My daughter thought she knew me: quiet, worn down, easy to dismiss. She didn't notice the shift in my eyes, the patience sharpening into something colder. One evening, she invited me over for dinner. Not out of kindness, I suspected, but because her husband's parents were busy, and she didn't want an empty chair at the table. I went anyway, carrying a bottle of off-brand soda as my contribution. When I arrived, the house smelled of roasted chicken and rosemary. My grandson ran up, throwing his arms around me. For a brief moment, warmth spread through my chest. But my daughter's voice cut it short. "Go wash up, honey," she told him, then turned to me. "Dad, you can sit at the small table. The dining table's full tonight." I glanced toward the long oak table where her husband's colleagues sat, laughing loudly, glasses of wine in hand. There was a chair open, but I said nothing. I sat at the small folding table in the corner, my plate balanced on thin legs of aluminum. As the meal went on, I listened. Her husband bragged about promotions, investments, the new vacation home they were planning. My daughter chimed in, talking about cruises and shopping trips, her laughter polished and bright. Not once did she look my way. When dessert came, I stood, carrying my empty plate to the sink. She barely noticed. Later that week, I asked her casually if she'd like to have lunch, just the two of us. She checked her phone, scrolling through her calendar. "Sorry, Dad. I'm really busy. Maybe next month?" The words were polite, but the tone was mechanical, detached. I smiled, nodded, and let it slide. Inside, though, I carved it into memory. At every turn, I tested. Small invitations. Small offers. Small ways to see if she remembered I was her father, not just an obligation. Every time, she chose distance. Every time, she reminded me exactly where I stood. What she didn't realize was that each rejection, each brush-off, only built my case. Not in a courtroom, but in the court of justice I carried in my chest. I wasn't angry, not outwardly. I wasn't bitter, not yet. I was patient. Because when the tide turned, when the truth finally came crashing down, I wanted there to be no doubt in anyone's mind: she had written this ending herself. And I would be there, silent but steady, to read it aloud. It was a Saturday morning when the first spark of kindness slipped through the cracks. My grandson had been dropped off at my place for a few hours, more out of convenience than trust, I suspected. My daughter and her husband had errands, so I became the babysitter by default. We sat on the porch, sipping sodas, his legs too short to reach the floor. He studied me with those sharp young eyes kids often have, the kind that see through walls adults pretend are solid. "Grandpa," he asked softly, "why are you always alone?" The question cut deeper than he knew. For a second, I couldn't find words. But then I smiled, patting his shoulder. Alone isn't always bad, I said. Sometimes it just means you're strong enough to stand on your own. He nodded, thoughtful, then leaned against me. The weight of that small gesture felt heavier than gold. Later that week, I ran into an old friend outside the bank. He had once been a lawyer, now half retired but still sharp as a blade. We shared a coffee, and though I didn't reveal the ticket, I asked him questions, hypothetical ones, about trusts, wills, and how families could twist them. He chuckled knowingly. Blood doesn't always mean loyalty. Paperwork, though, that lasts. If you ever need help, you know where to find me. I stored his card carefully in my wallet, right beside the folded lottery ticket. Even the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Walker, seemed to sense something. She waved one afternoon while trimming her hedges. "Don't let them walk over you, John," she called. "You're tougher than you look." I didn't answer, but her words stayed with me. One by one, in quiet ways, allies appeared, not the ones who filled banquet tables with laughter, but the ones who showed up without being asked. The ones who saw me not as a burden, but as a man still standing. And though I kept my secret close, I realized I wasn't as invisible as I thought. The silence I carried wasn't weakness anymore. It was strategy. And with allies, however small, however subtle, my silence began to take shape into something far stronger, a plan. I didn't rush. That was the secret. When you've spent a lifetime being patient, working long shifts, saving pennies, raising a child who never noticed, you learn the value of waiting. But waiting doesn't mean standing still. It means preparing. The Monday after running into my old lawyer friend, I called him. We met at a quiet cafe off Main Street, the kind of place where conversations disappeared into the clink of mugs and the hiss of the espresso machine. I told him enough to spark his attention, though I never said the words lottery ticket out loud. Let's just say, I began carefully, that I came into something significant. I need to make sure it's protected. Not just for me, but for the people who actually care. His eyes sharpened. He leaned forward. Trusts. You'll need airtight trusts. And someone you can count on to execute them. Don't let sentiment decide, let paperwork decide. By the time we finished, I had a plan. He would help set up a living trust, with contingencies that couldn't be bent by tears or tantrums. Names could be added, or removed, with a signature. The next step was the bank. I walked in wearing my old jacket, the same one I wore to patch the roof or buy groceries with coupons. To the teller, I was just another retiree cashing checks. That was fine. The less they saw, the safer I was. Behind closed doors, I signed documents that would never make their way into casual family conversations. Account numbers. Legal clauses. Safety nets. Each page felt like another brick in a fortress no one knew I was building. At home, I locked the paperwork in a metal box beneath my bed. My grandson's drawings were taped to the lid, crayon sketches of trees and stick figures, camouflage no thief would ever think twice about. The silence continued. I still showed up to dinners, still brought pies no one touched, still sat at the folding chair in the corner. But each insult, each smirk, each dismissal only fueled my determination. They thought they had stripped me bare, reduced me to scraps. But behind the mask of an old man too quiet to matter, I was weaving a net strong enough to catch every lie, every betrayal, every greedy hand that reached too far. And when the time came to pull it tight, they wouldn't even realize it was there until it closed around them. By early summer, the mask of civility had worn thin. My daughter and her husband no longer bothered to hide their arrogance. To them, I was no longer a father, no longer even a man with dignity. I was background noise, someone to be spoken over, dismissed with a wave of the hand. At a barbecue one weekend, her husband raised a glass of wine and bragged loudly about the vacation home they had just closed on. Lakefront property, he said, grinning. Worth every penny. And with the cruise coming up, this year shaping up to be the best yet. My daughter beamed at him, her hand resting proudly on his arm. We've worked so hard for this, she said, though I couldn't recall a single day either of them had ever truly worked hard. Then, as if to twist the knife, she added, honestly, Dad, you wouldn't understand. Times are different now. It takes real planning, real strategy, to live well these days. The words hit harder than any slap. A lifetime of double shifts, calloused hands, and sleepless nights, and she called it not understanding. I didn't respond. I just nodded, chewing my food slowly while the others laughed. Later, when neighbors dropped by, she introduced her father-in-law with glowing praise. He's been such a guide for us, she said, her eyes shining. Like a mentor, really. Then she turned to me, her tone flat. And this is my dad. He's retired now. That was all. No warmth. No pride. Just 2 words, retired now. It was clear, they saw me as irrelevant, disposable. A man whose only role was to occupy space until he disappeared. But I was still watching. Still listening. At another gathering, her husband joked about me repairing my old truck in the driveway. Classic, he smirked. Spends hours fixing something worth less than the tools he uses. The laughter that followed echoed like a verdict. Even my daughter laughed. I felt the weight of my wallet in my pocket, the folded papers, the trust, the ticket that had already rewritten my fate. They laughed at the rust on my truck, but they couldn't see the steel I had forged in silence. Their greed was growing, louder, shameless. Every careless insult, every arrogant boast was another stone in the wall they were building between us. And when the time came, that wall wouldn't protect them. It would collapse on top of them. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to remind them who I was or what I had given. The silence was enough. Because silence carried weight. And mine was growing heavier by the day. It happened on a humid July evening, during yet another family gathering at my daughter's house. The dining room buzzed with chatter, wine glasses clinking against plates stacked high with food. I had taken my usual spot at the end of the table, half in the shadows, a silent participant in a show I no longer recognized. The conversation turned, as it often did, to money. My son-in-law boasted about his latest business deal, while his father nodded along, offering advice like a seasoned king addressing his heir. My daughter listened with admiration, her laughter loud and bright. Then, without warning, her husband turned toward me. "You know," he said with a smirk, "we've been generous letting you stay here all this time. A man in your condition should be grateful." The table fell silent. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hum of the ceiling fan. My daughter didn't rush to defend me. She didn't correct him. Instead, she tilted her head, lips pressed tight, as if she agreed. The words hung heavy in the air, crueler than any insult that had come before. Letting me stay here. As though I hadn't once been the foundation beneath her life. As though I were nothing more than an unwanted guest in the home I had helped her build. I set my fork down, the metal clinking against porcelain. I looked around the table, at their smug faces, at the empty space where respect should have been, and I felt something inside me settle. Not rage, not despair. Something colder. I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't remind them of winters without heat, of double shifts, of the sacrifices that had paved their path. I just smiled. A small, steady smile that none of them understood. Because in that moment, I knew. This was the line. The last insult. The breaking point. And while they believed they had silenced me for good, what they didn't realize was that silence can be sharper than any blade. Soon enough, it would cut them clean. The morning after that dinner, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The breaking point had passed. Now came the quiet work of moving forward, without them, without their permission, and without a single warning. I started small. A call to the lawyer. Another visit to the bank. Each signature, each notarized page tightened the net I had been weaving in secret. My trust was complete now, every clause crafted with precision. My grandson, my few true allies, would be protected. My daughter and her husband? They weren't even footnotes. Next, I found an apartment across town. Nothing flashy, a clean one-bedroom overlooking a small park. The kind of place where no one asked questions, where neighbors minded their own business. I signed the lease under the name of the trust, not my own. To anyone else, it looked like a retiree scraping by. To me, it was freedom. The day I moved out, I carried my life in 2 suitcases in a cardboard box. No speeches, no dramatic goodbyes. I left a note on the kitchen counter, "Don't worry about me. I'll be fine." I doubted they'd miss me. In fact, I imagined them celebrating, mistaking my absence for defeat. Maybe they thought I'd finally realized I wasn't wanted. Maybe they thought I'd run off to some cheap apartment, broken, humiliated. That illusion suited me perfectly. In my new place, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of rejection, of being shoved into the corner of someone else's home. It was a chosen silence, a clean slate. I unpacked slowly, placing only what mattered on the shelves, my grandson's drawings, the worn photo of my daughter as a child, and the locked box that held the paperwork and the ticket that had changed everything. From the outside, nothing looked extraordinary. An old man starting over. But under the surface, every move was deliberate. Every detail was preparation. I walked the park in the evenings, nodding to strangers, my hands in my pockets. Nobody knew that the man feeding pigeons on a bench was worth more than the homes surrounding the block combined. Nobody guessed that behind his calm expression was a plan quietly falling into place. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Because when the curtain finally rose, the ones who had dismissed me would be the most unprepared of all. It didn't take long for whispers to start. When an old man disappears from the house where he's been tolerated like clutter, people notice. Neighbors asked questions. Some wondered if I had gone to live with relatives. Others assumed I'd been sent to a nursing home. The truth, my quiet escape into independence, was far less dramatic, but to them, it seemed like I'd simply vanished. From my new apartment across town, I watched the story unfold through small-town gossip. At the grocery store, I overheard two women murmuring by the produce section. "Poor guy," one said. "I heard he couldn't even afford rent anymore. Had to pack up and leave." "Shame," the other replied. "After all he did for that family." Their pity might have stung once, but now it only made me smile. Let them think I was broke. Let them believe I'd been pushed aside. The lower their expectations, the sharper the shock would be when the truth came out. Meanwhile, at my daughter's house, the narrative was different. She and her husband leaned into it, painting me as the pitiful old man who couldn't take care of himself. At a neighborhood gathering, she laughed lightly when someone asked about me. "Oh, Dad?" He finally realized he couldn't keep up. He moved into some little place, probably barely scraping by. "It's better this way." Her husband chimed in, smug as ever. We told him we couldn't carry his weight forever. It was time for him to face reality. The crowd chuckled, nodding, drinking in their version of events. My daughter wore the mask of a dutiful child, one who had done all she could for her aging father. Behind closed doors, I imagined the relief on her face. One less burden. One less mouth. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I wasn't surviving. I was preparing. The trust was signed. The finances secured. The ticket itself had been verified, locked safely in the vault of the State Lottery Commission. The check was being processed, and soon the world would know my name. The timing mattered. I didn't want to be the man who bragged too early or showed his hand before the stage was set. I wanted the revelation to come when their arrogance was at its peak, when they were most certain I had been defeated. And judging by their laughter, their smugness, and the way they bragged about casting me off, that moment was fast approaching. They thought they'd seen the last of me. But they hadn't even seen the beginning. The announcement came on a Thursday morning. I was sitting in my modest apartment, sipping black coffee and watching the local news. The anchor's voice was calm, almost routine, until the words landed. "One lucky ticket sold in our state has matched all 6 numbers of last week's drawing. The jackpot, $120 million, has officially been claimed." The screen flashed my name, my face, a photo taken at the Lottery Commission when I'd signed the papers the day before. In the picture, I wasn't smiling wide. Just a small, measured grin, enough to tell the world I knew exactly what I was doing. By noon, my phone buzzed nonstop. Calls, texts, voicemails. Numbers I didn't recognize. Reporters knocking at the building's front door, neighbors craning their necks to glimpse the man who had turned a dollar ticket into a fortune. By afternoon, the story had spread everywhere: TV, radio, social media. My name wasn't just in the paper, it was trending. And by evening, I knew the whispers at my daughter's house had changed. Gone was the smug laughter about Dad scraping by. In its place, shock and panic. At a dinner party, neighbors turned to her with wide eyes. "Wait, you mean your father? The winner? That's incredible. You must be so proud." I could imagine the flush on her face, the awkward smile she forced. My son-in-law, usually quick with a joke, probably choked on his wine. For the first time, they weren't in control of the narrative. That night, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw them, my daughter, my son-in-law, both dressed neat, their faces arranged in practiced concern. The same people who had laughed at me, dismissed me, called me a burden. I didn't answer. Instead, I sat back down, turned the volume up, and watched the news replay my photo on the screen again and again. The caption read, "Local retiree wins $120 million jackpot." The city was buzzing. The world was watching. And my silence, the same silence they once mistook for weakness, was now deafening. For the first time in years, the power wasn't in their hands. It was in mine. And I wasn't about to let go. 2 days after the news broke, they came back. This time, they didn't just ring the bell, they knocked, loud and insistent, as though they had some right to my door. When I finally opened it, my daughter stood there, eyes wide and glistening. Not with love, not with shame, but with rehearsed tears. Her husband hovered behind her, his smile too tight, his hands clasped like he was preparing for a business pitch. "Dad," she breathed, her voice breaking on the word. We're so sorry." I leaned against the doorframe, saying nothing. Her husband jumped in, his tone syrupy. "We've been meaning to visit more, but you know how busy life gets. We should have done better. You mean so much to us." I almost laughed at the performance. The same man who had mocked me for fixing my truck now wanted to play the role of caring son-in-law. My daughter reached for my arm, but I stepped back just enough to let her hand fall into the empty air between us. "Do you remember Father's Day?" I asked quietly. Her mouth opened, then closed. She blinked rapidly, fumbling for words. "Dad, that was just a silly mistake. We didn't mean anything by it." Her husband forced a chuckle. "Exactly. A joke. We always knew you were special, always." The memory burned bright in my mind, the cruise package, the cheers, the laughter. And then the scrap of paper handed to me like an afterthought. A $1 ticket, mocked and dismissed. "Funny," I said, my voice cold. "Because I remember exactly what you meant." The air grew heavy. My daughter's tears finally spilled, streaking her cheeks. She reached again, this time with desperation. "Please, Dad. We can fix this. We're family." Family. The word landed like a stone. Family had been the weapon they used against me, the excuse for every insult, every dismissal. Now they wanted it to be a shield. I straightened, my voice steady. Family doesn't laugh at you in front of a room full of people. Family doesn't treat you like a burden. Family doesn't remember you only when they smell money. Their faces fell. My son-in-law tried one last smile, brittle and breaking. "We can make it right. Just give us a chance." I held the door halfway open, long enough for them to see the finality in my eyes. "You had your chance," I said simply. And then I closed the door. The sound of the lock sliding into place was louder than any shout, heavier than any insult. It was the sound of justice beginning to settle. The days that followed were filled with a strange calm. Reporters still lingered outside the building, cameras waiting for me to step into the spotlight. Neighbors whispered. Old acquaintances reappeared, suddenly eager to reconnect. But I wasn't rushing. Justice wasn't about noise. It was about timing. And then the timing came. My lawyer arranged a press conference at the Lottery Commission office. The room was packed, cameras flashing, microphones lined up in front of me. I wore the same plain jacket I'd always worn, the one everyone had mistaken for a sign of poverty. My voice was steady, my words deliberate. "I've lived most of my life quietly," I began. "I worked hard, I raised a daughter, I gave everything I had. And for years, I was treated like I was nothing. But silence," I paused, letting the word linger, "is not weakness. Sometimes silence is preparation." The room hushed. I explained that the $120 million wasn't going to yachts or mansions or cruises. Instead, I had placed it all into a trust, structured, untouchable, airtight. The beneficiaries were clear: my grandson, a handful of charities, and those who had shown me real kindness. I didn't mention my daughter or her husband. I didn't have to. Their absence from the list spoke louder than any condemnation. When the statement hit the news, the fallout was immediate. At their country club, whispers turned into stares. Friends who once envied their lifestyle now looked at them with thinly veiled pity, or worse, contempt. The neighbors who had laughed along at my expense now remembered every word, every smirk, every dismissal. And they judged. My daughter tried to call again, leaving long, rambling voicemails about misunderstandings, about family bonds. Each one sounded more desperate than the last. Her husband sent texts about opportunities to invest together. I deleted them all. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, I sat in my modest apartment, paperwork neatly filed away, the trust secure. My grandson's crayon drawings hung above the desk, smiling suns, stick figure trees, a shaky outline of the two of us holding hands. That was where the money belonged, with the future, not with the greedy hands that had already proven their worth. The revenge wasn't in shouting or slamming doors. It was in watching their empire of arrogance crumble under the weight of their own choices. They had built a story where I was the burden, the joke, the man too small to matter. Now the world saw a different story, a man who had quietly held the power all along, who had endured the insults, and who, in the end, chose justice over forgiveness. The days that followed were filled with a strange calm. Reporters still lingered outside the building, cameras waiting for me to step into the spotlight. Neighbors whispered. Old acquaintances reappeared, suddenly eager to reconnect. But I wasn't rushing. Justice wasn't about noise. It was about timing. And then the timing came. My lawyer arranged a press conference at the Lottery Commission office. The room was packed, cameras flashing, microphones lined up in front of me. I wore the same plain jacket I'd always worn, the one everyone had mistaken for a sign of poverty. My voice was steady, my words deliberate. I've lived most of my life quietly, I began. I worked hard, I raised a daughter, I gave everything I had. And for years, I was treated like I was nothing. But silence, I paused, letting the word linger, is not weakness. Sometimes silence is preparation. The room hushed. I explained that the $120 million wasn't going to yachts or mansions or cruises. Instead, I had placed it all into a trust, structured, untouchable, airtight. The beneficiaries were clear, my grandson, a handful of charities, and those who had shown me real kindness. I didn't mention my daughter or her husband. I didn't have to. Their absence from the list spoke louder than any condemnation. When the statement hit the news, the fallout was immediate. At their country club, whispers turned into stares. Friends who once envied their lifestyle now looked at them with thinly veiled pity, or worse, contempt. The neighbors who had laughed along at my expense now remembered every word, every smirk, every dismissal. And they judged. My daughter tried to call again, leaving long, rambling voicemails about misunderstandings, about family bonds. Each one sounded more desperate than the last. Her husband sent texts about opportunities to invest together. I deleted them all. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the horizon, I sat in my modest apartment, paperwork neatly filed away, the trust secure. My grandson's crayon drawings hung above the desk, smiling suns, stick-figure trees, a shaky outline of the two of us holding hands. That was where the money belonged, with the future, not with the greedy hands that had already proven their worth. The revenge wasn't in shouting or slamming doors. It was in watching their empire of arrogance crumble under the weight of their own choices. They had built a story where I was the burden, the joke, the man too small to matter. Now the world saw a different story, a man who had quietly held the power all along, who had endured the insults, and who, in the end, chose justice over forgiveness. The storm passed quickly after the press conference. Reporters drifted on to the next big headline, neighbors grew quiet, and my daughter and her husband learned how fast a spotlight can turn into a searchlight. Every whisper, every raised eyebrow in their community reminded them of what they'd thrown away. For me, life slowed into something simple and peaceful. I kept the apartment across from the park. I didn't need a mansion or marble floors to feel rich. Most mornings, I'd brew strong coffee, open the window, and listen to the sound of children playing on the swings. In the afternoons, my grandson would visit. We'd sit together at the worn kitchen table, him coloring with his crayons while I read the newspaper. Sometimes we'd walk to the park, his hand tucked in mine. He never asked about the money. He didn't care about numbers on a screen or accounts in a bank. All he wanted was time, and that was something I could finally give him without worry. One weekend, we had a picnic. Just sandwiches, lemonade, and a blanket spread across the grass. The sun was warm, the breeze light, and for the first time in years, I felt at home in the world. My grandson leaned against me, pointing out shapes in the clouds, his laughter echoing like a song. That was wealth. Not the check, not the trust, not even the security it bought. Wealth was peace. Wealth was knowing I had stood firm, that I hadn't let betrayal define the rest of my story. My daughter tried a few more times to reach me. Letters, messages, even showing up at the building once more. Each time, I kept the boundary firm. The trust was already sealed. Her choices had spoken louder than her apologies ever could. And though part of me ached, because no father wants to cut his own child from his life, the ache was softer than the one I had carried all those years, being treated like nothing. This ache was clean. Honest. Final. In the quiet evenings, I would sit on the porch with a glass of water, watching the streetlights flicker on. My lawyer once told me, paperwork doesn't lie. But I realized something else: betrayal doesn't lie either. It reveals who people are when they think they hold the power. And justice, when it finally comes, doesn't shout. It simply stands, steady and undeniable. As the sun set behind the park that night, painting the sky orange and gold, I whispered to myself, and maybe to the memory of the man I had been before it all. Betrayal cuts deep, but justice always finds its way. I closed my eyes, breathed in the still air, and let the peace settle. The story wasn't about the ticket anymore. It wasn't about money. It was about respect, and the price of forgetting it. And I knew, as surely as the night would fall, that this chapter had ended exactly as it should.